to welcome each of you, all of you who are online, and also all of you who are in person here at this first Monday forum featuring Bruce Gregory and his award-winning book, American Diplomacy's Public Dimension. There are three quick reasons. I'm particularly pleased to have the opportunity to have helped organize this event along with Mike Korp. Bruce and I were at American University together, School of International Service, and so I claim knowing him longer than anyone else, perhaps in the room. Bruce, I know Whittle Johnston, your favorite professor, would be very proud. Secondly, Bruce's wife, Paula Causey, to whom the book is dedicated, and I understand is the chief editor. Paula was my control officer in Indonesia in 1972 when I was conducting research for CUOPP on the Asian and Pacific Student Leader Project. And finally, I'm delighted to have this chance to open this special program because as Barry Fulton stated recently, a lot of people write a book, but Bruce has written the book on public diplomacy. I want to say special thanks to all of you for coming. Kristen Kahn, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Global Public Affairs is here. Kristen, delighted that you're part of our network. Special thanks to Dr. Vivian Walker, because Vivian will actually make some comments after Bruce makes the primary presentation, and she will also moderate this session. And we all know her as the executive director of the US Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. She also rose to the senior foreign service position of minister counselor. She teaches at Georgetown University, but Vivian, we're very grateful you're an active volunteer board member with PDCA. Our tech host, Gabby Stahl, is the Hans Tom Tuck Graduate Fellow for PDCA. Haley Pottle, one of our rising professionals, is helping her with this task. Want to say a special thank you, Bruce Guthrie, our volunteer photographer, whose incredible talents. This is for you, Bruce, by the way, to honor that, Bruce, because we're very grateful for all you do to make the programs we put on come alive. Co-sponsors for today's forum, the USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy, and also the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. And it's my privilege to hand over the microphone to the director of the Institute, Dr. Will Yeomans. He's a teacher, he's a scholar, he's author of Unlikely Audience, Al Jazeera's Struggle in America. And even more important to that, he's a strong partner to PDCA. Will, we're grateful for all you do for this wonderful space that you make possible. So please do the honors. Will Yeomans.
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you to PDCA for putting on this regular program, which has been such a boost to the public diplomacy education. That's a big part of what the Institute's work is. I am doing a little more than introducing Bruce because Bruce has been such an important person in the history of the Institute and also personally a mentor for me in many ways. Bruce began here at GW more than 2 decades ago in 2002, and his tenure has been filled with dedication, a commitment to education, sharing his expertise to advance knowledge and practice of public diplomacy. Now, just to give you a little history, IPDGC was originally founded as the Public Diplomacy Institute. Bruce was there from the beginning to shape it from its very first moments, along with Barry Fulton, Steve Livingston, Walter Roberts, Barry Zorthian, and others. Then he directed the Institute from 2005 to 2008, establishing many of the Institute's linchpin activities. Of course, Bruce has helpfully documented this history in a chronology that we have on file at IBDGC. So thank you for doing that, Bruce. It's important to the institution's memory that we have this kind of documentation. And of course, as you see from his book, he's very meticulous and careful in the way he documents histories. So Bruce was a part-time faculty member at this university from 2002 to 2017. He imparted wisdom and insights to both undergraduate and graduate students through courses on public diplomacy, media, global affairs. These weren't merely academic exercises. As we hear from alumni to this day, they were transformative experiences that inspired students to pursue paths and careers dedicated to public diplomacy. On a personal note, when I got to GW in 2012, Bruce was one of the first members of the faculty to welcome me warmly, and he took me to lunch several times. I think it was Aroma, the Indian place, was one of our favorite places. Now out of business. Probably our fault for not going to lunch more. But Bruce, your warm mentorship to me in those early years is one of the most memorable things about GW. And then seeing you at the conferences, ISA, was something that I valued very much as well. One of Bruce's enduring contributions is the consistent assembly of a bibliography of new works related to public diplomacy and international communication, which he generously allows IPDGC to host and archive on the Institute's website. If you're looking for what's the latest research that's coming out in public diplomacy, do check out our website to find his list of resources. This invaluable resource serves as a beacon of knowledge for scholars, practitioners, policymakers, and our students. His new book, which you've seen, America's in hard copy here, American Diplomacy's Public Dimension, Practitioners as Change Agents in Foreign Relations, traces the evolution of American public diplomacy from colonial times to the present. This book is really only the latest manifestation of Bruce's unwavering commitment to education, and it is a testament to the constant sort of giving, Bruce, that you've been undertaking as a figure within the study of public diplomacy. So I'm very excited to see you present today, and I want to welcome you up and thank you for everything you've done for us.
Wow. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Will, for those kind words. And thanks to you all for coming. Before I talk about the book, a word about GW and other universities with strong ties to what I call diplomacy's public dimension. As Will noted, GW's partnership with the Public Diplomacy Council began 24 years ago, almost a quarter century. He gave you the names of some of the founders who were members and still are members of the council. I'd like to add one other name. The then director of the School of Media and Public Affairs was Jean Folkerts. And her support was pivotal and it included at the time even a fundraising visit to California to meet with Charlie Wick. So Jean Folkerts was essential. But a number of other universities have played a considerable role in the connection between academic study and professional practice. The State Department practitioners began arriving as PD fellows here. Today, FSOs Chris Teal, Tom Miller, and Pat Cabra are teaching courses here. At USC's Premier Center for Public Diplomacy, Jay Wang, Nick Cole, Adam Powell, Judy Kang, Sohaila Amory, USI retiree Robert Banks, and others are connecting academic study and practice. Students, practitioners, and faculty around the world make their way to CPD. Vivian Walker and Global Ties CEO Catherine Brown are teaching at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Previously, PDCA's Pamela Smith, John Brown, Tom Tuck, and others did so as well. Tuck's pioneering book, Communicating with the World, was published at Georgetown. Jerry and Ambassador Tony Wayne teach cultural and public diplomacy at American University. PDCA's Mike Schneider has been indispensable at Syracuse University's Washington program for years. And at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, former PD Undersecretary Sarah Sonnenschein is teaching public diplomacy. Before her, it was Ambassador Bill Rue. Fletcher has been hosting practitioners for a year of professional education since the 1970s, including notably Donna Oglesby, who taught for years at Eckerd College, and Len Baldiger, famous for his email listserv. All supported by Fletcher's distinguished professor of diplomacy, Alan Henriksen, and the family of Edward R. Murrow. It was at Fletcher, of course, in the 1960s that retired diplomat Edmund Gullion famously adopted the term public diplomacy. And PD practitioners have been teaching at the National Defense University since well back to USIA days. Academic study and professional practice are separate domains for very good reasons, but both have much to gain from collaborative ties. And in this, as in so much else, public diplomacy practitioners have been pioneers. There's recent good news. At last, the State Department seems open to professional education throughout a career, in addition to training, something the military has understood for generations. And scholars increasingly are studying and researching what practitioners do to provide evidence-based support for their concepts and theories and peer-reviewed publications. Okay, now turning to the book. I want this to be a conversation, but I'll open with 4 questions. Why did I write it? What's it about? What surprised me about writing it? And what are some takeaways for diplomacy today? So first, why the book? About 10 years ago, when I began thinking about it, I happened to be sitting behind 2 friends and former colleagues at a Senate budget hearing. One was a champion of America's exchange programs, the other a stalwart defender of the voice of America. For some reason, I leaned over him with a grin and said, public diplomacy's tribal cultures. The encounter contributed to a book, not as the work of one government agency or a foreign service career track, but about rival practitioner communities, foreign service officers, cultural diplomats, international broadcasters, soldiers, covert operatives, citizen front groups, democratizers, and White House aides. Communities with different tools and methods and distinct patterns of practice. Communities that adapted, led by change agents from within. It would be a book that would engage diplomacy's public dimension broadly understood, that would appeal to practitioners, contribute to the teaching and academic study of diplomacy, and to professional education. I'm immensely grateful to PDCA member Kathy Fitzpatrick, founding co-editor of Palgrave Macmillan's series on global public diplomacy, for making the book possible, and to so many of you, scholars and practitioners, for the ideas, experiences, and comments that shape my thinking. So what's it about? Briefly, it's a story of how change agents and PD practitioners in the field, viewed in a macro sense, transformed America's diplomacy and foreign relations. Transformation that's a cause for celebration, not something to lament as a golden era loss. The book's central focus is not Washington or top-down laws and mission statements, although some are in the book. It's not about policies or events, except as context. It's about what practitioners do and why. It's about diplomacy's rebels, who were forced to deal with skeptical traditional diplomats and cope with Americans who don't understand or much care about PD, except when threatened by war. One of PD's outstanding practitioners, Bob Chatton, captured the era well. Early in his career, he encountered State Department officers who said something like, "Bob, you seem like a bright young man. Why don't you get out of this Mickey Mouse peripheral PD thing you're doing and get into the real Foreign Service?" Well, that peripheral PD thing over the decades became central in mainstream diplomacy. Practitioner communities are rivals, turf-conscious tribal cultures, communities that compete for attention, resources, and independence, not hermetically sealed. There are lots of cross-border connections and family resemblances. Diplomacy with publics is as old as diplomacy, but its institutionalization in the US government goes back only about a century. The book treats American diplomacy's public dimension in the broad context of historical turning points, societal drivers of an American way of diplomacy, and the ways practitioners developed tools and methods. It's not meant to be a history. It has a chronological arc. The origin story goes back to Roger Williams' public diplomacy during the Pequot War in the 1630s. Diplomacy between European colonists and native peoples existed for 150 years before the US became a state. The act of Michael Douglas and Benjamin Franklin notwithstanding, US public diplomacy did not begin with the turn of a switch when Franklin went to Paris and when Thomas Jefferson wrote about a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. The turning points are US statehood, the invention of the telegraph, citizen diplomats in the war with Mexico, the Creel Committee in World War I, treaty organizations in peacetime after World War II, and today's digitalization and societization that take diplomacy beyond embassies and foreign ministries. The book has 4 broad themes that I describe as societal drivers of an American way of diplomacy. First, a preference for military and other hard power instruments over diplomacy. Second, episodic interest in public diplomacy correlated with war and ambition. From the Pequot War to 9/11, Iraq and Afghanistan, Americans rediscovered public diplomacy in wartime. Third, communication methods of an individualistic culture that prioritizes information, messages, and short-term results. Long-term relational methods matter, but less so. And a fourth societal driver, American exceptionalism, a belief that this nation is great and uniquely virtuous, that America's ideals of democracy and freedom are universally relevant, and that the US has an obligation to steer history and lead in world affairs. The centerpiece of the book are its 9 chapters on change agents and innovative practitioner communities. It concludes with chapters on the 21st century and thoughts about where we go from here. The book's an American story, but it draws on the insights of a global community of scholars and the ways US practitioners engage with foreign publics. The third question, what surprised me in researching the book? I hadn't thought about this until USC asked me recently to do a book Q&A. So the question itself was a surprise. On reflection, I decided there were 4. First, the massive scale and transformative impact that PD practitioners collectively have had on American diplomacy and foreign relations during the past 75 years. Most practitioners know what they do individually can make a difference, but few step back and consider their combined impact over the decades. Lawmakers can pass a Smith-Muntat or a Fulbright-Hays Act, and create a US information agency, Voice of America, or a National Endowment for Democracy. But it takes practitioners to develop reliable tools, methods, and patterns of practice over time. Second, I was surprised that so many talented practitioners had benefited from a year of academic study or an out-of-organization assignment before they contributed to a significant change in their communities of practice. A third surprise was the importance of Native American diplomacy to understanding American diplomacy's public dimension. And fourth, the power of what is called practice theory, meaning the analytical and empirical study of what diplomatic practitioners do in situational contexts. It's a research approach that many scholars now use to think systematically about diplomacy and international relations. Finally, what are some takeaways for diplomacy today? First, interagency coordination. Term often used, rarely well defined. This one does have a Washington focus. At its second meeting in 1947, the National Security Council charged the Secretary of State with, quote, coordinating the implementation of all information activities designed to influence attitudes in foreign countries, end quote. It created a National Psychological Strategy Board led by Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, Edward W. Barrett. How exactly an Assistant Secretary of State coordinate military services and cabinet departments was not spelled out. The effort quickly failed. For 75 years, the U.S. repeatedly built coordination structures at the National Security Council and at the State Department that failed to endure. There has been a persistent faith in the holy grail of coordination and a persistent unwillingness to provide the means to do so. After 9/11, the Defense Science Board conducted 3 separate year-long studies on strategic communication. About a half dozen PDCA members participated. In each report, the Science Board reached the same conclusion. Real change could only be achieved through a revision of the National Security Act. We called for new NSC legal authorities. Authority to assign tasks to government organizations, but not direct their execution. The right to concur in the appointment of senior executive branch PD officials, and authority to transfer funds between agencies within appropriation cycles as unexpected circumstances might warrant. Focus was on people and money and sources of power in Washington. Senator Richard Lugar and Representative Mac Thornberry introduced draft legislation. Ben Rhodes and the Obama NSC had no interest. Today, the odds of legislation are slim to none. The odds of coordination to Groundhog Day loop continuing are high. More hopeful takeaways focus on society and all of government diplomacy. My last chapter looks at ways for practitioners to think about and achieve change. I'll highlight just a couple. Given today's complex technologies and wicked problems, practitioners need what I call cross-category knowledge. By this, I mean broad issue awareness, not subject matter expertise. They need lateral skills and enough understanding of the languages of complex policy issues and knowledge domains to connect experts in government and society in ways that are diplomatically productive. Diplomats, of course, need strong public communication and language skills. They need agility, critical thinking, capacity to innovate. Second, practitioners need a learning culture. There have been a number of recent reports that make this point. And they need professional development. George Kennan, in the late 1920s, and a few of his Foreign Service colleagues, was sent by the State Department to Germany for 2 years to learn about Russian culture and history. The State Department paid for 2 years of living expenses, their tuition, and books. It's really hard to imagine that happening today. Ambassador Bill Burns says his generation of diplomats had plenty of specialists in nuclear arms control and oil pricing mechanisms. But late in his career, he says he spent too much time in meetings with smart, dedicated colleagues, collectively faking it on the intricacies of cyber warfare and the geopolitics of data. Veteran diplomats like Burns and Tom Pickering and Ron Newman call for an analog to the military's culture of professional education. It's not the same as training. It's incentivized professional education, and it's essential throughout a career. It can be achieved by time spent at universities, think tanks, operations, and interagency assignments. PD practitioners also need to think in terms of leveraging comparative advantages. About 10 years ago, Ambassador Roxanne Cabral was on assignment from state at the Atlantic Council. She was the lead author with Global Ties CEO Catherine Brown and others of a pioneering report, Diplomacy for a Diffuse World. It's online and worth a read. It's short. We made a key assumption and two compelling claims. The assumption, globalization, urbanization, and fragmentation are reshaping the world order. Claim one, US diplomacy requires a fundamental retooling, a more deliberate and serious engagement with global trends and new actors, both within government and civil society. Claim two, diplomatic practitioners, especially in the State Department, must prioritize their power to convene and connect others to diplomatic advantage. This means using data to understand and engage local populations, focusing more on cities. 2 years ago, state created a special representative for city and state diplomacy. And it means adopting whole of government and whole of society mindsets. The State Department, of course, should attend to its capabilities and exchanges, global media, public affairs, and the PD responsibilities of all of its missions and bureaus. But in the book, I argue it should do much more to think outside the department and leverage what others are doing and can do better. Diplomats and foreign ministries in the US and abroad often lament their loss of primacy in whole of government diplomacy, but they also have substantial advantages. If practitioners use those advantages wisely as they think about and seek to achieve change. So let me leave it there, except to say PDCA, GW, and USC are well positioned to make good things happen in diplomacy's public dimension if they continue to leverage strong partnerships in society and whole of government diplomacy, if they continue to foster a cadre of rising professionals, and if they focus on the future. Taking care to honor the past, not as something lost, but as a strong tradition of change agents who transformed American diplomacy and foreign relations. I look forward to your questions and conversation.
Thank you very much, Bruce. It's a pleasure to be here today with such distinguished friends and colleagues, both with us in the room and online. What I'd like to do before turning over to hearing from you and your questions is give you a sense of what appealed to me about Bruce's book from my dual perspective as someone who has been a practitioner of public diplomacy, but also more recently a scholar and a teacher. So first, I was drawn to the concept of reframing public diplomacy as American diplomacy's public dimension, which, as Bruce notes, highlights public diplomacy's centrality in the practice of diplomacy. One of the perennial challenges faced by public diplomacy practitioners in the Department of State and elsewhere, I'm sure, has been the perception that public diplomacy is an add-on to diplomacy rather than integral to the profession. For example, in reflecting on her tenure as the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Charlotte Beers described public diplomacy as, and I quote, a barnacle on the ship of state. And we all remember what Murrow had to say about takeoffs and crash landings. But Bruce's definition of diplomacy's public dimension is familiar. an instrument used by states, sub-state, and non-state actors to understand cultures, attitudes, and behaviors, build and manage relationships, influence thoughts, and mobilize actions to advance interests and values. What is new and important about this definition is that it places public diplomacy at the heart of diplomacy, rather than relegating it to a secondary support function. Second, I admire Bruce's refreshingly clear-eyed conceptualization of what he describes as a distinctly American practice of diplomacy. He identifies, as he mentioned, a set of unique and enduring patterns for this practice that resonate throughout the book. These include an episodic focus on public diplomacy that coincides with existential threats to national security. Major shifts in public diplomacy priorities, institutions, and practices have been motivated by conflict. World War I and the Creel Committee, World War II and the VOA, the Cold War and USIA, the short-lived end of history, followed by the long war on terror, and a series of counterterrorism communication centers. Check out our new report on that. It's online, Global Engagement Center, and so on. Bruce also helpfully elaborates what he describes as a messaging and information dominant communication style. Our first default in public diplomacy is advocacy, getting the message out and using data to amplify actions and policies. Bruce correctly, I think, links this to the American prioritization of the individual and the fundamental right to self-expression, the I in diplomacy, if you will. Bruce also calls out the American exceptionalism embedded in our diplomacy, the promotion of American values, the enduring power of democratic institutions, and its dominant role on the global stage. This, as we know, is a source of America's soft power appeal, but it can also be a vulnerability when, for example, our exceptionalism veers into the imposition of values or perceived violations of cultural sovereignty. Third, I'm delighted that Bruce has definitively given public diplomacy a unique origin story. While, as he points out, there is already a good amount of scholarship on the 20th and 21st centuries, this is the first study to cover the evolution of public diplomacy from the early colonial period to the end of the 19th century. This book offers especially creative reimagining and reframing of pivotal moments in colonial and revolutionary history, highlighting the essentially cross-cultural nature of early American diplomacy. This historical overview also usefully covers the transformative communication technologies that drive major shifts in public diplomacy institutions and practices. We are, of course, laser focused on the digital age, but the book reminds us of the equally disruptive and empowering effects of the telegraph, telephone, radio, and television. Fourth, I applaud the book's definitive expansion of the community of practice, long overdue. In keeping with what Bruce identifies as the essentially social nature of diplomatic engagement, he broadens the definition of a PD practitioner well beyond the Foreign Service to include soldiers and civilians, cultural and media influencers, journalists and broadcasters, and so on. He makes a compelling case for the outsized influence that these change agents can have on foreign audiences. Now, this doesn't mean that Bruce is promoting an idealized version of these change agents as selfless contributors to the greater American good. In fact, he makes the point that they are driven by rivalries, competing interests, and distinct and sometimes incompatible operational imperatives. But it does make an elegant case for the power of public diplomacy to model the robust give and take of democracy. Finally, as someone who came quite late to the game of academic scholarship, I appreciate Bruce's approach to public diplomacy as a multidisciplinary practice. The source material for the book alone proves the point. It draws from a variety of intellectual disciplines: history, literature, diplomacy studies, communication theory, public relations, cognitive framing, social psychology, network theory, and so on. All these dimensions contribute to and embody the breadth of practice. Ultimately, in my view, this book pushes on the boundaries of diplomacy's public dimension. His final advice is about managing and even, dare I say it, cultivating disruption and disruptive change rather than opposing it, relying on broad lateral knowledge, a willingness to embrace risk, the imperative to convene and connect, and above all, to remain imaginative in the face of constraints. For the full span of his career, Bruce has not only stood his ground on public diplomacy, but created the ground on which we stand. American diplomacy's public dimension does both, giving PD an origin story and a philosophical foundation. It offers an informed, proactive defense of public diplomacy as both a performative practice and a systemic team. Thank you, Bruce, for doing all that. So we're going to move to the Q&A, and I'm going to move myself here. And I will take the moderator's right to ask the first question of Bruce. Already, okay. So you mentioned in the book, you say something in the book about putting diplomacy first and technology second. What does that mean?
Well, thanks for the comments and thanks for the question. I borrowed my thinking on this from a professor at DePaul University, a friend and colleague. His name is Jeffrey Wiseman. And the basic argument, I think, is that technology changes happen to diplomacy. They should be used by diplomats, but they shouldn't become diplomacy. And Wiseman cautions against using terms like digital diplomacy and data diplomacy and quantum diplomacy, because they put the technology cart before the diplomacy horse. And the argument is that we need to distinguish between technology awareness and technology fluency. Awareness means understanding the value and possibilities of technologies, acquiring basic skills. Diplomats need to be technology literate. They need to know how waves of digitalization and artificial intelligence can facilitate and complicate diplomatic agendas. Fluency means expertise and understanding the viability of technologies. We need specialists to make technologies work to diplomatic advantage. And you can't, in my judgment, be an active diplomat dealing with everything that comes your way and also be a deep dive expert on artificial intelligence and quantum diplomacy. So we need a partnership here. And I was delighted to see last week that the State Department has recently announced it is the first U.S. government organization to adopt a new technology platform at Purdue University's Institute for Tech Diplomacy. It's an online platform, centers on teaching and how new technologies are being commercialized and their foreign policy risks and opportunities. So I think it's a good example of technology fluent experts partnering and enabling technology aware diplomats.
All right, well, while you're thinking about your questions, I'll follow up with another one. You mentioned that state is no longer a gatekeeper in whole of government diplomacy. That, of course, presumes that it might have been at one point, but in any case, that is no longer a gatekeeper in whole of government diplomacy, but it has substantial advantages. What do you mean, and what are they, especially given your comments about the challenge, shall we say, of interagency cooperation?
Okay. Years ago, the State Department subcontracted economic and financial issues, trade issues, agricultural issues, commercial issues to other government departments. The U.S. military carries out diplomatic functions. We talked before about the problems with coordination and lack of strategic direction. I think it's fair to say that most people look to the State Department for what it can achieve in diplomacy, but often think that the State Department is not the gatekeeper as it may have been decades times. That said, my argument is that diplomacy practitioners have substantial advantages if they leverage what others do in ways that are diplomatically productive. State diplomats typically have better foreign area and cross-cultural communication skills. Most have higher levels of global awareness. Many are skilled at managing teams, policy analysis, and advising political leaders. Ambassadors and embassies have standing and symbolic value. Ideal hubs for addressing today's transnational and geopolitical issues, and for convening and connecting city mayors, corporate executives, technology experts, CEOs, public intellectuals. I can hear some of you saying that's what we always did. Fair enough. It's true. But it was secondary, not a priority. And the argument is that today it needs to come first. Foreign ministries and embassy national staffs have institutional memory of diplomacy's usable past, another advantage. And diplomats have established networks with stakeholders. And then finally, as I argued, public diplomacy is now mainstream. So there are plenty of advantages, but it's a way of thinking differently. The default position is not, how can I get more money for exchanges next year? An important question, but arguably, it's how can I leverage what the many exchange activities of the United States government outside the State Department can achieve. And the State Department's exchange programs, as important as they are a minority of what the U.S. government spends on international exchanges in a given year. Thinking differently is, but with the advantages.
First of all, thank you very much for the presentation.
I think, do we have to use the mic? Okay.
Just stand up. Okay. Up here.
That is for the online audience.
I don't have a question on that topic. So thank you very much, Bruce, for your presentation on your book. I look forward to using it with my students next year and having them come and talk to my class. My question actually had to do with some of the debate that we have these days over using diplomatic tools to communicate to the American public. So if you remember President Biden's diplomacy or for the middle class, foreign affairs for the middle class. And there's been a lot of discussion at the State Department and effort to try to get people out talking more to the American public. How do you see that fitting into this whole of government and public dimension to diplomacy?
Some years ago, Secretary of State John Kerry, I think it was, in one of his first speeches said, there's nothing foreign about foreign policy anymore. And so the academic literature and the professional practice of diplomacy is at a place where there's no real line between foreign and domestic. In terms of practice, the State Department, of course, has always encouraged diplomats to go to their hometowns and talk about what they do. But if you think about the exchange programs in cultural diplomacy, if you think about democratization and the democratizers, they have been partnering with American communities for generations. So there's nothing new about that. The military, as a diplomatic actor, communicates with domestic and foreign audiences all the time. The White House, when John Kirby gets up and gives a public statement on any given day about what's going on in Ukraine or elsewhere, he's talking to an American audience and he's talking to foreign audiences as a practitioner in diplomacy's public dimension. So I think occasionally State Department diplomats may have to pay attention to what lawyers might say about how they carry out their work, and that's worth doing. And I think we have to remember an American society that has been so reluctant to engage in public diplomacy that they had legal restrictions on the domestic dissemination. of what the programs of the U.S. Information Agency or the broadcast of the Voice of America. I think that world's gone, and that all practitioners need to. I mean, Bureau of Global Affairs in the State Department has merged public affairs, domestic, and public diplomacy, international. And so far, nobody has chirped about that I've seen. So, doesn't mean it won't happen because it's there and it can be used for partisan purposes, but take the risk and.
You might want to put the PDAS on the spot to discuss the PA, GPA kind of aspect. Not my role, however, to do that. Robert Hilton, I'm currently Foreign Policy Advisor to Chief of Staff of the Army, but a public diplomacy person going back a number of years. As you say, interest in public diplomacy has peaked perhaps in periods of war. Those of us who were serving at 9/11, there was a sudden dramatic increase in interest in what public diplomacy does. I think that also corresponded, of course, to the merger of USIA into state, and state sort of acquiring all of us and trying to address the question of why do they hate us? And then there was also perhaps an atmosphere of, okay, we're going to sprinkle some public diplomacy pixie dust on a particular problem or policy set, and that will solve it, which didn't quite happen that way. But at the time, Colin Powell said, so every Foreign Service officer needs to be a public diplomacy officer to get out there and address the question of why do they hate us. If every Foreign Service officer is a PD officer, then what are those of us who specialize in public diplomacy? Is there a need for the education and training that you have advocated for? Or is that perhaps an overly broad statement on the part of a well-intentioned Secretary of State? Thank you.
You raise a lot of threads in that question. And, I guess I'll begin by saying my last job when I was in government was the fall right after 9/11. And Joel, remember, I was the day shift coordinator for an operations center on public diplomacy. The first and only time that I know of that the State Department has set up a 24/7 public diplomacy unit on the 7th floor of the State Department. And it lasted for about 4 months, and then history took over, and that was that. It was another coordination mechanism that didn't endure. But with 9/11 being fresh in the minds of the American people, the State Department was really concerned about public diplomacy. Colin Powell was really concerned about what it meant for, I mean, we set up linkages with London and Islamabad, sent public diplomacy officers out to handle 24/7 breaking news with global audiences. That was 24 years ago, 23 years ago. And so that's just basically a historical bit of why public diplomacy is discovered in areas of elements of crisis. I'm not saying that we don't need specialized training, not at all. Absolutely, we need specialized training in the core skills of communicating with publics, with handling media relations, with handling the management of exchange programs. But arguably, these are skills, and the need for specialized skills are something that all diplomats need, and that we can achieve that by managing the skill sets, as well as my argument for professional education. I don't think diplomats, Henry Kissinger once said that diplomats dine on the intellectual capital they developed in graduate school or in undergraduate school, because they're too busy to do that when they're in operations. But providing the way the military does breaks for professional education, I just don't see, if public diplomacy is mainstream, not bolted on, I don't think we need specialized career tracks. And there are a number of reports that make that argument. I know it's controversial, and I'm sure in this room we can get a pretty good debate on that, but that's the argument. But I think we need the training, but all of diplomacy, all diplomatic practitioners need the training as well as the education. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Haley Powell, and thank you so much just for your time and for sharing your insights. I currently work at USAID, So all of your notes on the interagency need for coordination and collaboration resonates very true for me. I'm also a PDCA rising professional and a big PD enthusiast. I used to help manage the tech roles program from the State Department side. So the kind of exchange and international cultural competencies is also very near and dear to my heart. I work currently in the technology division at USAID. So your notes on digital diplomacy and the digitalization of how we're doing this messaging is very interesting to me. So I would love to hear any insights or thoughts that you have in terms of what the future of, I guess, what I'll call digital diplomacy looks like to you, and either any emerging or current trends that you're seeing in terms of how we need to communicate on the public level, as well as more of the formal channels from US government as well. So any thoughts would be great. Thank you.
Well, I'm probably going to disappoint you. My social media skills are terrible. I left government just as what websites and digital diplomacy were coming online. But I left at a time when the U.S. Information Agency had discovered digital diplomacy and was moving smartly into that world with change agents from within the professional practice USI as public diplomacy. And there were reorganizations at the time that achieved that. I have a lot of good friends in the academic world who write a lot about digital diplomacy. So I would encourage you to look up the work of an Israeli scholar, Ilan Manor, who has written extensively on digital diplomacy and a lot smarter than I am on giving you answers to a very good question. I'd go back and say that I don't think diplomats can be experts on the technology and experts in diplomacy at the same time at a very deep level. They need to be aware. They need to know how to use it. There are some Danish scholars who are doing work now on the hybrid nature of analog and digital technologies. And they're talking about how EU diplomats are using both. And digital technologies are becoming ordinary to your generation. They weren't to mine. But that is evidence, it seems to me, as it, you go back to the telegraph, you go back to the printing press, you go back to how things changed with new technologies. I have no idea if AI is going to become ordinary or if it's going to be the first really disruptive technology that your generation is going to face. That story is yet to be told. But all of the other technologies have become ordinary, all the way through to websites and social media.
Right. Hi, I'm representing the online Q&A. So Daniel Whitman posed a question to you. Could you comment a bit about how dark IOs complement or clash with conventional PD?
Dark IO.
Information.
That is a splendid question. And I found that most of the time I encountered this when I looked at what soldiers do in diplomacy's public dimension. The U.S. military has a very hard boundary between their public affairs cadre and their information operations cadre. In wartime, we expect just wars, that to be a lethal activity. And if it's a lethal activity in a just war, why isn't lying an appropriate activity in a just war? So the military deals with deception here and with public affairs here. And the public affairs people in the Pentagon that I encountered over the years were every bit as defensive of their credibility and transparency as any State Department public diplomacy officer I ever met. And they still had to deal with the information operations people. I recall one example in Kuwait. The dark side people were putting out lies about what Saddam Hussein's tank commanders were doing in the desert. And it was tough on the public affairs people because did they need to be witting in advance so they didn't damage the operation? Or was it better off for them to be innocent of what was going on and completely separate? I think some of them decided they needed to be witting, careful, and skillful with the way they handled their work. I think people like Chris Paul, who's done a lot of work on the dark side aspects of the military, argues for a structural separation between the two. But, you know, US diplomats going back to Ben Franklin have dealt with forgeries. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were funded by the CIA covertly for 2 decades. We sent students and intellectuals and writers and artists and journalists and religious leaders around the world for 2 decades during the Cold War, under cover of front groups in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So the dark side in that sense has a history. I don't know what's going on now, but I'm also struck with CIA Director Bill Burns, who has really moved into a different life, talks about intelligence diplomacy, which means making secrets available to diplomatic advantage. So famously, before Putin invaded Ukraine, the CIA convinced Europeans that it was going to have intelligence diplomacy. Not sure where that takes us, but there's a lot of history there, and I don't think it's gone away.
Before I retired, tried to measure results was in full swing. And I believe it's still the case that the public diplomacy officers are saddled with proving their worth more than any other part of the State Department. We have to have definable and measurable results for those things that we do. And you then find that people like former Secretary Gates and others make public statements about how we're getting our lunch eaten by Russia and China in the public arena. And this in the face of the strongest showing of solidarity by NATO in a generation, by the AUKUS agreement, by Finland and Sweden deciding to join NATO, by a number of things that are quite honestly going the US's way. So that leads me to believe what people are talking about is the global South, and that Russia and China are very strong there. And I'd like to know when that wasn't the case, should I talk to them? But my question is, what should we be measuring and where should we be measuring?
Most excellent question, and I don't think we're going to come up with a lot of easy answers now. It's somewhat like social media. I'm not an expert in evaluation methodologies, but my friends in public relations and some of my friends in public diplomacy who are will tell you that evaluation can be treated with quantitative methodologies if you spend enough money on it. And there's the rub. Practitioners would rather spend money on program operations than evaluation. And lawmakers would rather say, why don't you do more of it and not put enough money in to do it? So the people that have to do opinion research and evaluation are strapped for adequate funding to do what corporations do, what politicians do. I mean, politicians running for office spend scarce dollars to figure out what voters think. Corporations spend lots of money to figure out what consumers will buy. Why shouldn't diplomats invest substantially in developing a deeper understanding of what global publics are thinking and doing? So it's been a practical issue, it seems to me, for a long time in the world of public diplomacy. I don't know the extent to which that evaluation can make a serious difference in a particular issue set, like some of the ones you talked about. But I have heard enough expertise or enough experts to make the case that it can be done if you invest the resources to do it.
I would just add that in addition to the finding adequate resources, one thing we've noticed on the commission is the multiple ways of approaching monitoring and evaluation from different entities within the public diplomacy family. So you have competing models for research and evaluation, which also I think complicate issues. Is there another online question to finish us off here? Great.
I have one last online question from Michael Schneider of Syracuse. He's tuning in online. He asked, would you comment on the current role of PD in advising the interagency on crucial public attitudes abroad?
Mike, I don't know. This is an old issue in diplomacy. The idea that public diplomats should be in on the takeoffs as well as the crash landings, told famously by Edward R. Murrow and others. Any number of advisory reports, including the Advisory Commission's reports, have repeatedly called for public diplomats to be present when policies are being formulated, not just when they're being carried out. Not that public opinion should drive policies, but that public opinion should be taken into account when policies are being formulated. And I think there's a lot of agreement that that makes sense. Over the years, it has happened less often than it should. Arguably, the National Security Council needs the kind of professionals in the White House that can make arguments about what's going on in the rest of the world that can influence and have impact on how not only a policy is formulated, but how they're communicated. And so I think there are plenty of examples where that hasn't happened. Arguably, it should happen. I can't tell you on May, 5th, 2024, what's happening now in the State Department and what's happening now in the White House on this front. But arguably, a lot should be happening. There's a lot of history to suggest that if it doesn't happen, rise.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and for great questions. And I think we're ready now to have you take us home.
Thank you. Thank you, Vivian. Thank us also to Will Humans and to our tech hosts, Gabby Stahl and Haley Pottle. I'm Joel Fishman, president of PDCA. And of course, thank you to Bruce. Bruce, we've known each other for a long time, and I have never known you to disappoint. Folks, this is an important work. Oops. Can't even hold a book anymore. Anyway, this is important work. Over on the, there are some handouts on that table over there. Among them is this flyer telling you how to order the book. If you haven't read it yet, I urge you to do so. And for those of you online, we will put instructions on the website or somewhere for you to tell you how to get the book. Bruce, your contributions to our profession cannot be overestimated. Tune in on June 3rd, next month's first Monday, for PDCA's annual awards program, when the 4 2024 award winners will showcase their programs for us. It is encouraging and reassuring to see such evidence of skill and innovation in the new generation of public diplomacy professionals. These 4 winners each have a compelling story to tell. Because this program's participants will be strewn across many time zones, this program will be Zoom only. And on May 15, right here in this space and on Zoom at 12:30 Eastern Time, the Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy will present its special report, the Global Engagement Center. Vivian, do you want to add anything to this?
No, except it's available right now on the website if you want to take a look at it. And given that the attention that the Global Engagement Center is receiving these days, this is our attempt to provide sort of a balanced bipartisan look at its evolution. So I invite you to check it out.
Okay, information on this event and on the June 3rd, first Monday. It will be available on is available now on the PDCA weekly update, PDCA website, and on the weekly PDCA update, which comes out every Sunday. If you cannot find registration information, you're welcome to email me at president@publicdiplomacy.org. Glad all of you could be with us today, both here in the room and online. These programs are brought to you by this is my plug, brought to you by the GWU Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, the USC Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy, and the Public Diplomacy Council of America. Don't forget June 3rd. Don't forget May 15. See you then. Goodbye for now.